Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation, Do the Work, Anti-Racism and the Catholic Church. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Tia Noelle Pratt is the Assistant Vice President for Mission Engagement and Strategic Initiatives, Courtesy Assistant Professor of Sociology, and editor of the Journal of Catholic Social Thought at Villanova University. She is also President and Director of Research at T.N. Pratt and Associates, LLC. A sociologist of religion by training, Dr. Pratt received her Ph.D. in sociology from Fordham University. For more than 20 years, she has researched and written about how systemic racism impacts African-American Catholic identity. Dr. Pratt is also the curator of the hashtag Black Catholic Syllabus. Dr. Pratt's research examines the intersection of race and religion and the ways systemic racism impacts the experience of religion. Using ethnography and in-depth interviews, Dr. Pratt studies the Roman Catholic Church as an institution, providing needed sociological analysis of race and religion. Dr. Pratt is currently working on a book project, Faithful and Devoted, Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. This project draws on ethnographic data and in-depth interviews to investigate liturgy as a form of identity work and analyzes how systemic racism in the Catholic Church has resulted in the small number of African American Catholics. This project also addresses parish reorganizations resulting from church closings. Additionally, Dr. Pratt has conducted research on millennial generation Catholics and their attitudes towards pro-life teaching and young adults' engagement with society's major institutions. In future work, she anticipates focusing on pertinent social justice issues that are of particular concern to the millennial generation, including immigration and climate change. Dr. Pratt is an active and award-winning public scholar. She is currently a contributor to the National Catholic Reporter and has also written for The Revealer, America, and Faithfully. She regularly gives lectures for a wide audience and has given public lectures for the American Catholic Historical Society and the Diocese of Camden's Office of Black Catholic Ministry, among others. Dr. Pratt is also active in several professional organizations, including the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion and the Association for the Sociology of Religion. She regularly presents her work at national conferences. In 2019, Dr. Pratt was elected Secretary of the Association for the Sociology of Religion's Council. We are honored to have such a distinguished scholar speak with us tonight on this timely and important topic. Welcome, Dr. Pratt.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm and kind introduction, and thank you for being here, both are in person and online. It is a joy to be with you today on this snowy day, and it's 70 degrees in Philly today. So, but thank you. As I said, it's a joy to be with you, and so let's get started. And I just realized I got my own job title wrong in here. So it's Mission Engagement and Strategic Initiatives is what it should be, but I probably didn't have my glasses on when I did that. So, all right. So I want to start tonight by talking about the focus of our conversation this evening. And so I'll start by talking about my approach to the work. I do feel it's important at the outset to talk about that my work is focused in the United States. And that's that when I was at Fordham, a professor said to me once, be clear from the outset about what you're doing and what you're not doing. And I've tried to do that both in talks and writing ever since. So our focus tonight will be my approach to the work, and focusing on the United States in particular, anti-Blackness, what I mean by that, what I mean when I say the work and why that's in capital letters, how I see myself as both a scholar and practitioner, the Black Catholic syllabus, what's next, and how we can all engage in the work. So to start, I'm a sociologist. I know this is the School of Theology and Ministry, but it's important that you know that I'm a sociologist. And so I approach everything that I do professionally and really my life from the lens of sociology. And so for me, in terms of doing this work, it means discussing issues of race and racism from that perspective, and doing so with a level of authenticity that enhances and meets the standards of integrity that I hold myself to. But part of what that means is we need to be okay being uncomfortable, because talking about these issues does just that. And we cannot stop at the place where we reach discomfort, because then we're not going to do the real hard, difficult work around these themes. So we have to be ready to be uncomfortable. We have to be ready to make others uncomfortable. So, and appreciate the fact that none of this is easy. In fact, it's extraordinarily hard. And by that token, it is important that we allow ourselves to be in that space of experiencing and creating discomfort. And that's the only way we can do this in an authentic, legitimate manner. And in doing so, we have to create a space that centers those who have been marginalized. Because it is only when those who have been marginalized get to tell our own stories that we can do this work in the way that needs to be done, in the way that the moment and the time that we are living in calls us to, and what this moment calls us to. So, in that respect, ooh, a fancy slide. So in terms of systemic racism, sociologist Joe Fegan describes racism as foundational and systemic, and that it pervades all of society's core institutions. The economy, education, politics, religion, the family. Think of all of the firsts we are still experiencing in our society. We currently have the first Black vice president. We currently have the first Asian vice president. We just had the first Black Black president. And, we're still experiencing so many of these firsts. And because of that, even that by itself should tell us the ways in which systemic racism is still so deeply embedded in our society. But Fegan goes on to talk about racism in its means of being foundational and systemic as being oppressive and exploitative, and that it's designed to exploit land and labor for the material and social benefit of those who created society's core institutions and the hierarchies that lie therein. So, as I said, I'm a sociologist. I love institutions. Institutions are my bread and butter. And so this is what I look at every day. But in doing that, it's not enough to not be someone who engages in mano a mano or personal racism. This is the racism that in Racial Justice and the Catholic Church that Father Brian Massengale describes as the bad acts that one person does towards another. But it's not enough to not be that person, to not be the person who uses racial slurs or exhibits racist graffiti, or, hangs a noose on somebody's door or something like that. Because not being that person then allows folks to say that none of this has anything to do with them. And so when we look at this from the perspective of institutions, then we can see that all of this has to do with all of us, but not exactly in the same way. Still with me? All right. Online, you still with me? All right. So we must also think about the ways our systems are designed to benefit some while oppressing others. So in that respect, that brings us to what is the work? And I put the work in capital letters for a very specific reason, because I am convinced that that's how we must think of it. It's that important that we have to think about it in capital letters. And so the work is confronting systemic racism and building structures that are anti-racist and creating that narrative that centers the marginalized. But in doing that, we have to look at anti-Blackness as a specific form of racism. So sociologist Whitney Pirtle and her colleagues define anti-Blackness as a form of racism informed by white supremacist ideologies centered on the particular devaluation and exploitation of Black persons and is embedded in institutions, organizations, cultures, and so on. And so when we have this means, this tool that allows us to really see anti-Blackness, not only to just see it in a kind of, I know it when I see it type of way, but to be able to pick it out, then we are able to engage in the work at a new level. So Dr. Pirtle and her colleagues talk about anti-Blackness as being rooted in slavery and being exemplified in numerous social structures like politics and the military and education, and think about the legacy of Jim Crow that is still with us in so many different ways in our society. And the church is not immune to this. You know, my former colleague at Villanova, who is now at the University of Dayton, Dr. Shannon D. Williams, in her work, she calls the church the largest corporate slave owner in the Americas. Dr. Sean Copeland visited us at Villanova last week and gave a talk. And in her talk, she talked about living the legacy of chattel slavery right now. Think about the ways that this is still, seen in our society so many years later. The denial of access to the priesthood and religious life in the church. I mean, think about, this was one of the things that last week I spent time with my students talking about the places power is held in institutions. And we started at our own institution and then broadened from there. And, the priesthood, religious life, this is where power is in our church. And so if Black folks are kept out of the places where power is held, then that's how things like anti-Blackness are allowed to fester and grow. So, the refusal of admission to Catholic colleges and universities, you think about, I don't know the answer to this, but maybe you do. I mean, who was the first Black graduate of BC? I suspect it wasn't until after World War II. And maybe even later than that. Another former colleague at Villanova, Dr. Katie Grimes, in her work, she talks about anti-Blackness in the church. So these are things that we have to think about as we start to engage in what I like to call the work. And so if we do that, then we can move towards anti-racism. And that requires a shift in how we think. For too long, we have been limited as a society. We have limited ourselves as society and as church to the race relations model. The race relations model is the model of person-to-person action, person-to-person racism. But when we shift our thinking and move to the next level of racial justice, then we start to think about these things in terms of institutions. But also, let's think about how documents like Open Wide Our Hearts still have the race relations model as its core. Because if you have the race relations model at your core, then you don't have to talk about institutional level racism. You don't have to talk about being the largest corporate slave owner in the Americas and the ramifications of that all of these years later. So if we move to the racial justice model, then we start thinking about these things in terms of institutions. And then we can move to the anti-racism model, which allows us to then break down these systems and build new ones that are, in fact, anti-racist. So I like to talk about how anti-racism has 3 phases. The calling out of the racism, the making people feel uncomfortable. Phase 2, white folks realizing they're racist or not as progressive as they thought they were, or at the very least that the systems are racist and designed to work in their favor. And that's the point where folks can oftentimes are grappling for the first time with the notion that white supremacy is more than the Klan, the Proud Boys, and other armed, violent paramilitary organizations. Because those organizations terrorize folks so that they don't do the work and fight for justice. And so it is these violent paramilitary organizations that allow the rest of white supremacy to happen. So we've got to think about it that way. This is not limited to these organizations. That's just the violent part. The part of guns and murdering people. But it's the part that happens in jobs and the economy and getting a small business loan. That's the rest of it. This is the part that allows that to happen. So phase 3 is doing the work of dismantling these racist systems in order to build systems that are anti-racist. I only do parts 1 and 3. I only do parts 1 and 3 because part 2 is the white folks need to do together. That's not the part that I meant. So I like to, a former student of mine, one time she came to a talk that I gave over a weekend. And so we were talking about it the next day on Monday. And I said, yeah, this is what I do. I'm breaking down systemic racism, like Wonder Woman smashing the glass. And 5 minutes later, she emailed me this. And so I just like to use it to think about her. And it's a great way to articulate what I'm talking about. So Julia, that's for you. So, since early 2020, I have been faced with a pandemic, which is not over, although we have moved to a new level of pandemic living, but it's not over. The murder of George Floyd ignited so much in our society. And, Mr. Floyd's murder did not create these things, it revealed them. And that sparked a global reckoning from which the church is not immune. And we must listen to those who have been ignored. And so as we move forward into the next section, I'll talk about how I highlight some of these themes in my own work to do the work. So as I said, I see myself as both a scholar and practitioner. And in my career, I have always felt called to do more than scholarship for scholarship's sake. That we must make scholarship applicable to the world we live in. I'm not one of these sociologists that just writes up data for the sake of writing up data. I write up data because I think it's actually going to do some good. So as was said earlier, my research is about systemic racism in the Catholic Church and how it impacts African-American Catholic identity. And that has had many forms over the years. Most recently, I was a consultant to Pew Research Center on the report that came out about this time last year, Black Catholics in America, and its parent study that came out about a year before that, Faith Among Black Americans. I've served on the Racial Justice Task Force for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. I was scholar in residence at the Aquinas Center, a nonprofit in Philadelphia. I have served on the board of directors of my alma mater, West Catholic High School, where I was the founding chair of the Inclusion and Diversity Committee. Well, we'll talk about that another time. but that particularly was a way to take all of the years of research, all of these things that I talked about in the first section, and put it into action, in real world action. And if I can't use my scholarship for that, then why have I spent all this time doing it? I mean, that's how I look at it. So I want to talk about Catholic Blackness, what I like to call Catholic Blackness and Blackness that is Catholic. We think about, when we think about lots of different things in the church, so many firsts that are still happening or waiting to happen in our church. Of all the Black saints that we have in the Catholic Church, none of them are from the United States. But one of these 6 depicted on these banners could be. Henriette DeLille is where it is. She's about to get a new postulator, but her cause has been going on so long. Her poor Venerable Pierre Toussaint, he hasn't had a postulator in years. So we're still, working towards that first. That handsome little fella is a statue of Martin de Porres that sits in my office, was a gift from a friend who has great devotion to St. Martin. And, think about St. Martin was canonized hundreds of years after his death. He was canonized still 200 years after his beatification. So, Cardinal Gregory is our first African-American cardinal. When we think about the Catholic intellectual tradition, when we think about the Catholic literary tradition, we don't usually think about Toni Morrison. And why don't we? That's something that we have to think about, that we have to reckon with. So, okay. So Catholic Blackness and Blackness that is Catholic. So what does that look like? So I am in fact working on a book, still working on this book, but it's getting there. So Faithful and Devoted. So Faithful and Devoted uses mixed qualitative methods, historical analysis, participant observation, in-depth interviews, but it pushes back against this lingering myth that being Black and Catholic are not compatible, or that there are no Black Catholics at all, or, which is even more insidious, what few Black Catholics there are only trace their origins to conversions that took place after World War II. And that's just not true. Catholic Blackness and Blackness that is Catholic has existed in what is now the United States before there was a United States. And we've got to hone in on that, because that's how we're going to get to where we need to be. So in this book, I connect the dots of systemic racism. Because what I'm trying to do is, instead of looking at these things through place, which other scholars have done, I try to look at them through time. And that helps to show the systemic nature of this, because then if you're looking at this through time, then it shows that, well, what's happening in Chicago is at the same time as happening in Philadelphia, at the same time as happening in New York, at the same time as happening in Baltimore. And so then it dispels the myth that, well, this was just an isolated incident in one city. Not when it's happening everywhere. So, so in addition to that, I'm looking at contemporary parish life, particularly in predominantly Black parishes, and what that looks like in terms of using liturgy as a form of identity work, particularly in music, preaching, and church aesthetics, and how that is an act of resistance to racism. So here's a chart. When you're a qualitative sociologist like me, charts are not a big part of your work. And so I really love this chart. My quantitative friends, charts, they've got 4 charts in a paper. Me, I'm probably gonna have 1 chart in a book, and it's gonna be fantastic. So this is something I've been working with. This model is something I've been working with for a long time, and looking at liturgy and 3 styles of liturgy that I've identified, what I'd like to call traditionalist, spirited, and gospel, and how that manifests through music, homily, and aesthetics. So, the traditionalist mass is what you think it is. That's that 45-minute mass that you go to because something else is happening on Sunday morning, and you need to get in and get out. The spirited mass is just that. It's a little more spirited. The music is a little more lively, the preaching is a little more lively. But the gospel mass, that's where it's really at. But with the aesthetics, you can't change the aesthetics out, in between masses. But, the emphasis on African-American events like Kwanzaa and Black History Month, images of Jesus and Mary depicted as Black. And depending on the church, you could have these images juxtaposed against white images. And what that means is so striking and beautiful. And the emphasis on Black saints, I've written about, being at a mass, and there was a baptism, and so there was the litany of the saints, and all of the saints called were either Black or had very close ties to the Black community. And I had never heard that before. But then I was thinking, why haven't I heard that before? These are all saints of the church. They could and should be called in this way at every church. And yet they're not. So that's the chart. So I look at issues of race, space, and place, and really hone in on 2 key ways that Black parishes came into being. Specifically, those parishes that were specifically created as such as St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia, which I'll talk a little more about in a minute, or the parishes that developed through neighborhood changes, including the collapse of the national parish model. And those are the churches where you'll see, that juxtaposition of, the Black Jesus against white Jesus. Okay, so let's talk about place a little bit. So if you know Philadelphia, perhaps you recognize this as the southwest corner of 12th and Lombard, also known as St. Peter Claver. So St. Peter Claver, this building doesn't look like what you might imagine an old Catholic Church in the Northeast looking like. It's not this imposing stone edifice, but there's a reason. We're going to get to that in a minute. So, as I like to say in class, take that thought and hold it, because we're coming back to it. So the story of St. Peter Claver officially begins in 1886, when Black Catholics came together under the name Peter Claver Union. And these folks, they like, one of the things I write about in the book is like their Christian forebears, they started off at worshiping, coming together for worship in people's homes. And they would go to the existing churches in the area, but eventually their numbers grew, or the pastor changed his mind, and they wouldn't be allowed to worship there. So then they had to move on. And St. Peter Claver became the first Catholic church in Philadelphia designated for ministry to Black Catholics. And this is a time where folks are facing segregated communion lines, pew fees, being banned from parishes, as I just mentioned. And church on Sunday did not provide a respite from the racism they were experiencing every other day of the week. So 12th and Lombard is, at this point, at the turn of the 20th century, a prime location for a church like this. The neighborhood is transitioning to being heavily African American, and the congregation of the Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia had followed its members into West Philly and had relocated to 47th and King Sessing in 1891, thus leaving that building available. And remember I said we were coming back to that? That's why it doesn't look like this big stone edifice of a Catholic church that we are familiar with, particularly in the Northeast, because it wasn't built to be what? It was built to be Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. So for the history of St. Peter Claver, written for its 75th anniversary, credit was given to St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Ghost Fathers, Archbishop Ryan, and Patrick Quinn, who was an executive of Beneficial Bank, for raising the money to purchase the building. But that's not all that happened. The majority of the money came from the parishioners, who didn't have much of anything, but they managed to get the money together, most of the money together, to buy this church. But 75 years later, these white folks are getting the credit. And so this is what I mean when I talk about being erased from your own narrative, because it only gives passing reference to the Black parishioners whose loyalty and sacrifice made St. Peter Claver possible. But they did the lion's share of the work. And in order to get the church consecrated so that it could be used as a functioning Catholic church and the parish could have a home, the price they paid was having their name not included on the deed. So what they got was protective language in the deed saying that St. Peter Claver would always be used for the benefit of Philadelphia's Black Catholics. But they couldn't own their church. So this is what happens when somebody else writes our stories. So by the 1980s, the neighborhood is shifting again. Gentrification, even though we didn't call it that in the 80s, but gentrification is on the horizon. And the Archdiocese commissions a report. So let's talk about this picture a minute. So this, in the foreground is a playground that's about a block from St. Peter Claver. And in the background, you'll see this is a parking garage, but it's really a mixed-use building. Now, this parking garage was built in the 80s. And I mean, she's showing her years right now, but it was a marvel in the 80s to have this parking garage sitting on top of ground level retail space. On one end is a CVS, on the other end is a supermarket. Now, this is a neighborhood that has always been notorious for having difficulty in parking. But in the 80s, parking garage springs up. So, does the parking garage bring in people, or is the parking garage built as in order to accommodate the people who are already there? Okay, so the answer to that question is beyond the scope of my book, but somebody else should write that book. So I hope they read my book and say, you know what, I should do that, and then go do it. But this was these kinds of buildings, they're common now. They weren't common in the 80s. So this is really showing how the neighborhood is changing and who it's changing for. It's not changing for the people of St. Peter Claver. So the Archdiocese commissions a report, which is known as the Sites and Boundaries Report, which is released in April of 1984. And it recommends keeping the church open because the church is newly financially viable because the school has closed. It is within what the document calls the urban renewal neighborhood of Washington Square West. And as the report says, has real symbolic significance to the Black Catholics of Philadelphia, who might feel they have been abandoned if the church closes. And that the report also goes on to say that the issue of the protective language may lead to unpleasant complications. Well, even though the report recommended keeping it open, the parish was suppressed in May of 1985. And that triggered a long court fight, hence the unpleasant complications. And so the civil court battle ends in Philadelphia Orphans Court. Orphans Court has jurisdiction over these matters. I'm not sure why, but it just does. In 2017, where the protective language is interpreted as to allow for the sale of the property. And it's interpreted that way. And the outcome is that the money that will come from the sale will be used to benefit Black Catholics in Philadelphia. Hence, it was deemed that that move would honor the protective language that was in the deed and is binding. So the civil court matter concluded several years ago. But the advocates and descendants of St. Peter Claver shifted their fight to canonical court, where it's still ongoing. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a new appeal was filed on behalf of St. Peter Claver to the Vatican. So the story of St. Peter Claver isn't over. But this story is not unique. There are so many churches that are not there anymore. And one of the things that I tell students about, one of the things I talk about in church and in talks, just as another example, the small corner of West Philly where I grew up. When I was a kid, there were 4 Catholic churches in that small corner of West Philly. Now there's 1. And some of those folks have experienced the pain of losing their church and parish reorganization 2 and 3 times. And we know that every time that happens, there are folks that just don't move on to the next church. And so as that happens again and again and again, then we start to realize why it is that numbers are dwindling the way that they are. And the Pew report goes into some of this detail about particularly Black folks who were raised Catholic and don't practice Catholicism as adults. So what happens now? So we have to really look at what is lost? What are the consequences when we lose our churches and sacred spaces? The Pew data tell us that only 17% of Black Catholics worship in a predominantly Black church. But this ongoing loss of sacred space, it impacts, particularly in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest, racial minorities, the poor, those who are already marginalized. And frankly, an institution can't continue to marginalize people and expect those people to be active in the institution. It just doesn't work that way. So, as I said, I see myself as a scholar practitioner. So messy, we like to call it. Mission engagement and strategic initiatives is what I do at Villanova, and I've been there almost 2 years now. And as I told some folks who were kind enough to take time out of their day and have lunch with me today, if I'm going to say that, what I do in a sentence, it's that my work and my job is to help advance the university's anti-racism work through a distinctly Catholic lens, to show that this is the work of the mission, that this is the work of the church that we're doing, that the DEI work and the mission go hand in hand. And to push back on those that say that it isn't, and confront that false equivalency of Catholic with whiteness. This idea that, well, what you're doing, if I had a nickel for every time, well, maybe not a nickel, $1, for every time I heard, well, this isn't Catholic. And then I had to say, what you mean is it's not white, but it is most definitely Catholic. So there's that. So there's the messy work, which I'll talk more about in a minute. My public scholarship. And this is, folks ask me all the time, how do you manage to do this? I had a dissertation mentor, James R. Kelly, who is now retired, retired from Fordham, who did this. He frequently wrote for publications like America and Commonweal before his retirement, in addition to serving in our professional guilds and doing journal articles and all of that. So I saw from the earliest points that this could be done, that you could walk both paths and have that work recognized. So as was said earlier, I've served as a contributor to NCR, but also written for Commonweal in America and Faithfully, as a way to communicate what I do to a larger audience. But we're all called to do the work daily. And, think about this in ways like our curriculum, hiring, and not just who we hire, but how we hire. If we've been doing the same 3 things when it comes to hiring for the last 50 years, then we can't be surprised when we get the same results. So if we want to hire differently, then we've got to upend how we hire. And, recognize our civic engagement, pay people what they're worth. Too often I hear, oh, it's the work of the church, you should be doing it for free. No, I spent years becoming me. Value that, because institutions put their money behind what they value. So, is an anti-racist church even possible? Well, if it's going to happen, it's going to be because we do the work in all facets of church life. Looking at our chancery offices. Why is it that too often Black leadership in our chancery offices begins and ends in the office of Black Catholics, if there still is an office of Black Catholics? Because in so many dioceses, there isn't anymore. Let's think about our nonprofit board leadership. Nonprofit board leadership is something that matters a lot to me. But also, education, parish life, how we approach problems and struggles like the sex abuse crisis. There are still layers of that we have not gotten to. We haven't talked about the orphanages the way that we should and need to. Church-run residential facilities for Indigenous children in Canada and the US. Canada is farther ahead in this than we are, but this work is going to be difficult, it's going to be painful, and it's going to go on for a long time. So, and the fact that we have a Secretary of the Interior who is herself an Indigenous person is going to matter a lot as this work continues in the United States. So in short, we have to push the church beyond the limits of white comfort. And we have to look at, this idea of, so often here, oh, we want Black people, we just can't find it. That's not an answer. It's not an answer. So, so a couple things about kind of what we're doing what I'm doing in my work as a scholar practitioner and what's happening at Villanova. So the Black Catholic syllabus was launched in 2020. And so I launched that because I firmly believe that the period of history we're all living in, not through, we're living in. Because if we're living in it, then we've got to really embrace the moment. If we're living through it, we're just trying to get to the other side. So the moment that we're all living in calls each of us to concrete action. And I knew that this was something that I could do. So this syllabus is a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States. It's intended for everybody, academics, journalists, educators, parishes, congregations of men and women religious. But it prioritizes the work of Blacks in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative. So a couple things at Villanova. The Mother Mary Lang Lecture in Black Catholic Studies happens every November. It is our signature event for Black Catholic History Month. And so we are in the initial stages of planning for our third annual Mother Mary Lang Lecture, which will happen this November at Villanova. We've also instituted the Billings Fellowship, which is a fellowship that supports a lay Black Catholic in pursuit of a master's degree in ministry and theology. And in order to train the next generation, we've committed, these resources to train the next generation of Black Catholic leaders in our church. And it's named for Sister Cora Marie Billings, a Sister of Mercy. And Sister was the first Black woman to enter religious life in Philadelphia. She is a Villanova grad. This picture was taken when she received an honorary doctorate from Villanova in 2019. So it was right there. You know how you say it was right there. How could you miss it? Well, we didn't miss it. We didn't miss it in terms of, naming this fellowship. And at our most recent Mother Mary Lang lecture back in November, we unveiled to the university community newly commissioned artwork, An Unlikely Equilogy, North African Saint of Hippo, created by the Dallas area-based artist Vernon Adams. And this is a portrait of St. Augustine depicting him as a Berber man and bishop. And we want this is the real thing. That's the digital image, which is so great and so beautiful, but this is the real thing from the night of the unveiling. And it is so powerful. And just the artistic work and what it means. And we want to shape the narrative. What does it mean for the church to have an African man as one of its greatest writers and thinkers, whose work transcends the church into academia and not just theology? And to focus on Augustine in this way matters. And this painting and having this at Villanova, and there's so much. I see this painting truly every day when I go to work, and I am still finding new things in it, even after the months that it has arrived on campus and been with us. And so even down to the book, the open book on the soul, as representative of his work and his writing. So, this painting is calling us to think about Augustine in a way that is more authentic, and then confront why we haven't been doing this all along. And like I said in a talk I gave on a different subject, but I like to bring him in when I can. So on a different subject at the university a couple of weeks ago, I said, let's face it, in 100 years, when Villanova is still going strong and all of us are long gone, this painting is probably going to be in a basement somewhere, because there'll be nobody left to remember why this painting matters and why commissioning it matters. But what this painting is calling us to do can outlive all of us if we put in the effort and do the work. And so, what would something like this at BC look like? I don't know the answer to that. That's something for you as a community to think about and perhaps, decide and do and be as we are heading down this path at Villanova. So what happens now? So we must keep up the fight for justice by doing the work and actively resist the racism that plagues our church. And that often means getting into trouble, as John Lewis said, good trouble, necessary trouble. Or how my dear friend, Sister Cora Marie, has taught me to get in trouble. She calls it making people mad. Making people mad. Sometimes the best times is when you don't realize that you're doing it. You're just out here in the world, doing your thing, being yourself. I see this as the modern day overturning of the money changers' tables. That's where I take my lead from the Gospels in doing this work. And centering our own stories means others don't create our narrative, that we get to do that ourselves. And so to conclude, I like to pause a minute and invite those who have joined to think and reflect on the question, what do I know now that I didn't know before? And with that, we'll conclude. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, it works. So I was wondering what kind of advice you have to offer about taking conversations like this into places they're not necessarily welcome. I'm thinking, I used to teach at Father Judge in Northeast. And that having a conversation like this could be difficult. And at various times, I think I got better at it over time, but it was still really very, very difficult, I think, to get a lot of people in this specific community to be in a place where they would be open to hearing something other than what they came into the conversation already wanting to think.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So a couple things. I'll say first, you can't be afraid to keep going. That's the first part. The second part is, eventually, and this is something that I was, an audience member in a webinar that Father Brian Massengale gave once, and he talked about in the Q&A that you can't be in dialogue with people who don't want to be in dialogue. And at some point, I have found that, once the train starts leaving the station, folks either get on board or they move on. And so once the train starts leaving the station, then folks need to decide, are they going to be with this work or not? So I will say this, you can't be afraid. You can't be afraid to make folks uncomfortable, as I said in the beginning. So there's that piece. But there's also the piece of, this is so hard. But part of that is making the shift in thinking. Because too often folks think, well, how dare you say I'm racist? And I don't know you like that, but I was in a conversation with someone once, and I was talking about these kinds of things, and she's like, how dare you say I'm racist? How can you think that? And I was like, I don't know you like that. I don't know what you do. Maybe you are. I don't know. But what I'm talking about, it's not how you act. I'm talking about the systems. I'm talking about the institutions that we live in. And if you can't see that, then you're not ready. So you need to go and get ready and then come back. Yeah? Okay.
We have a question from our online audience.
Okay.
Yes, someone online says, I noticed that one of the ways forward was curriculum.
Mhm.
As a Catholic educator, I'm curious as to what guidance you have around where to begin with curricular reform.
Yeah. Okay. So curricular reform. Well, one place you can start is the Black Catholic syllabus. That's why it's there. If you're looking for, just a place to start, because I know, particularly in high school curricula, you want these resources, and you get handed a curriculum and it's just not there. So, one of the reasons that I formed the Black Catholic syllabus in the way that I did was so that there would be materials that were accessible to folks at all levels who were interested in engaging in this work. So, there is work written by esteemed scholars for other scholars, but also work by those same scholars that is intended for a larger audience. And so for those who are getting into these themes for the first time, I would encourage you to start in the public scholarship section. Those are items that are written for publications like America, Commonweal, National Catholic Reporter, particularly for a wide audience. So it's very accessible. And then kind of move on from there. And I get it that when you're handed this particular curriculum that, as a teacher, as an educator, you can't necessarily just throw it out and start over if you want to keep your job. I mean, if you don't want to keep your job, maybe you can. I don't know. But there are, for lack of a better phrase, there are workarounds. You can say, here are the things that we are given by the curriculum, but then we can add on to it. When I was still on the board of the high school, and they were saying, well, we can't undo the curriculum. I said, nobody says you have to. If sophomore year English is U.S. literature, nobody says you have to change that, but you can add other U.S.-based writers to that curriculum. So you don't have to upend everything in order to make these changes. So thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. On a similar note, so the curriculum, or yes, the syllabus, it has I guess content. Is part of that content, would it help with pedagogy? I guess for those of us that are thinking of going into teaching, like there's content, but then also to help us with pedagogy as well.
Now you've got me running through the whole thing in my mind. In terms of actual pedagogical technique, I'm not sure that, honestly, I'm not sure that there is. There's plenty of content. But I think the content can help shift pedagogy. especially when the content talks about the need for bringing these things into our spaces. And so how do I do that pedagogically? And part of that is knowing what I don't know. Is that helpful? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question.
We have another question from our online audience.
Yes, this question reads, I understand some of what's involved in doing the work as an individual, but I struggle to take it effectively to a systemic level without seeming to be quote unquote preaching.
Yeah, no, I hear that. Part of it is, part of doing this and making this commitment is that there are going to be folks who don't want to hear it. But that's not a reason not to do it. I do remember, maybe I shouldn't say this since this is being recorded, but who cares? It just made me think about, something I was doing and I believe very strongly in when I was an undergraduate. And one of my classmates got mad at me and she stormed out of the dining room one day during lunch. And from that day to this, she has not spoken to me. The last time I saw her at a class reunion and I said hi and she looked at me and walked away. So anyway, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to bump your head on the podium. Don't be afraid to do the work. Don't be afraid to not have somebody speak to you for 20 years, because if somebody is not going to speak to you because you are working towards justice and you are working towards the mountaintop, that person was never your friend anyway and probably doesn't deserve to be your friend. So that's that.
Thank you, Dr. Pratt. I'm really interested in the question of aesthetics and how it intersects, particularly with our theologies. And that is something as a school where kind of our dean has just announced we're beginning a process of looking at the art and environment of the school. And I know you mentioned like you certainly can't say what the painting or portrait like for BC would be, but I guess as we start that process as a school, do you have any advice for us?
Sure. So, that type of sacred art audit, is important to really kind of take stock on what you have, why you have it, who is depicted, and why, and also things like, who your buildings are named after and why, and who has been erased from the narrative. And can you reclaim them? Can you reclaim them in art? Can you reclaim them in nomenclature? What I would definitely say the sacred art audit is the place to start. If you decide you want to commission a painting, I know a wonderful artist I'd be glad to recommend. But especially, as we are thinking about, the cause of the 6 African Americans and the need to really elevate their causes and in some ways their common cause, especially since so many of these have kind of languished for a long time. It is up to all of us to make sure that these future saints of our church become saints of our church. So I would say, do the audit. Once you have the audit, look at who you have and who you don't have. And this is what I say a lot of times in spaces, and particularly in nonprofit work that I do and all of that. Ask yourself, who is not here? And then figure out a way to go and get them. So whether it's, how we depict, who we depict in art and what that means and how we create that narrative around that, that can be important. And it's a way to shape the narrative that will continue long after we're all gone.
Yes, this question regards to how to go about institutional transformation.
Mm.
I'm a Redemptorist priest,
Mm.
and my province has made a commitment to African American ministry, and we've done that through basically one. I don't know. I don't want to say throwing money at the problem, but we've we've committed to sponsoring African American theologians to get more Black Catholics in theological discussion. We've committed ourselves to our one African American. Well, we have two African American parishes, but one centrally. But I feel like coming from a province is, I mean, we're just a bunch of white guys. I mean, there's one African American in my entire province.
Mm.
And I feel like there's a lot of institutional blindness to institutional racism.
Mm.
We simply don't see it. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, we're cutting these checks. We're going to make sure that this parish is staffed. But I always ask the question is like, what are we not seeing as a bunch of white guys? And how do we see it? How do we open our eyes to institutional racism that we're just not even conscious to?
So I'll answer that question with a question. Have you asked the Black people you work with? Have you asked the Black people in these parishes? What is it that you aren't seeing and aren't doing? Because they know, and they probably haven't told you because you haven't asked. And if they tell you, then you'll know what to do. And one of the things that I learned and saw very early on in researching the book, people welcomed me into their homes. They cooked for me. They treated me as family. And I realized early on, that I'm asking them about their experiences of church, that for many of them, this was the first time they had been asked. And when they were asked, they had so much insightful things to say. So they know, but they probably haven't said unless they've been asked. So, and then I'll also say that, that shift in thinking from race relations to racial justice to anti-racism, that has to be done, that shift in thinking. And I know I talk about it in just a few words. That's because I've been talking about it a long time, and I learned from someone how to be succinct. But I realized that this is not easy. It is not easy to think in this way. This is to think in terms of institutions. And so, so that's my first thing is they know, and they'll know, and they'll tell you if they believe you really want to know.
Tia, thanks so much for a wonderful talk. I was really intrigued by the framing of liturgy as identity work. Props for a great chart. I'm a sucker for a good chart. I wonder, because it seems like that chart applies in the Pew Research. It applies to 17% of parishes that are, Black parishes. So I wonder in the 83% of mixed parishes, how can we see the work being done in liturgy in those places? How can the work of decentering the story or recentering on the story of Black folks be done in those spaces of liturgy?
Sure. So, okay, so I want to start by saying that the Pew study says 17% of Black Catholics worship in predominantly Black parishes. So that means 83% of Black Catholics worship in parishes that are not predominantly Black. So, but what do those parishes look like? Are they predominantly white parishes? Certainly they could be. Are they predominantly Latinx parishes? Certainly they could be, especially as you get off of the East Coast and more towards the West Coast. Are they perhaps shared parishes? What Brett Hoover, who's on the faculty at Loyola Marymount, what he calls in his book, The Shared Parish, how he identifies shared parishes. It could be any of that. So how does this get done when you're not at a predominantly Black parish? So it could get done in a number of different ways, and it doesn't always have to be in liturgy. I mean, even at my parish in Philadelphia, we have upcoming the international dinner. That's what it's called. It's the international dinner. And so it's just a wonderful experience. And, you know, the parishioners bring all of these different foods from, you know, from their own background, and we come together as a parish community to share that. And it's just a wonderful experience. At Villanova back in November, we had a mass to celebrate Black Catholic History Month. And so we invited a Black priest from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia to come and celebrate mass. And we also invited the Philadelphia Catholic Gospel Mass Choir to join us for the liturgy. And the director of the choir was adamant that Villanova's pastoral musicians participate in the music for that mass, because otherwise it would have been the gospel choirs coming to give a concert. And none of us wanted that. And so by her working with not just the choir, but the Villanova pastoral musicians for the music for that liturgy, then it became, you know, this beautiful expression of liturgy. So something like that, you know, the specifics depend on what you have, you know, available to you. And, you know, there was a church that I went to years ago that they had an event. I forget what feast, I forget which feast it was, but they invited parishioners to bring depictions of the Blessed Mother from all types of, so you had Our Lady of Africa, and you had Our Lady of Vietnam, and you had all of these different, and you had Guadalupe, and you had all these different depictions of the Blessed Mother that were celebrated and honored at this one particular liturgy for this feast. But it was also, this is how the parishioners celebrate and honor the Blessed Mother at their homes, because they were bringing these depictions from their homes to church to participate in this liturgy. So, I mean, so those are just a couple of things. But you know, what's going to work for your parish or your church community depends on what you have right there in front of you. But, you know, don't be afraid to try.
We have another question from our online audience.
Mhm.
It reads, how can liturgy be a space for cultivating a capacity for discomfort so we can do the work? They wrestle with questions of enculturation and appropriation, and they ask if you can speak about this, especially in predominantly white parishes.
Yeah, that's a lot right there in that question. So, okay. So here's what I'll say. I'll start off by saying, you know, are you talking to, I'll go back to what I said a minute ago. Are you talking to the folks in your community about these things? Are you taking the lead from them rather than doing what I spent, 45 minutes talking about erasing the narrative and of people of color, of people who have been marginalized, and creating a new story. So if you're not doing that, and if you're listening to these folks, then you're already on the right track. You know, don't go out if you're, an all-white parish, predominantly white parish, don't go out and get a Lead Me, Guide Me and say, okay, we're going to sing songs from Lead Me, Guide Me, and it's going to be great. No, you Lead Me, Guide Me. Lead Me, Guide Me cannot be handled by folks who don't know how to handle Lead Me, Guide Me. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, it's a powerful tool, It's a powerful tool. Lead Me Guide Me's been around since what, 1987? I have a first edition Lead Me Guide Me on my shelf in my office. I mean, I wouldn't be doing my work properly if I didn't have my own personal copy of Lead Me Guide, despite the fact that I'm not a musician.